The morning of August 21st, 1942, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. Corporal Robert Leckie pressed himself deeper into the muddy foxhole as the first screams pierced the darkness. Across the Tenaru River, somewhere in that wall of jungle, 800 Japanese soldiers were gathering for an assault that their commanders had promised would sweep the Americans into the sea. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Japanese infantrymen had been told they faced only a small patrol guarding Henderson Field. They had been trained in the Banzai charge since basic training, drilled in the belief that superior spirit and cold steel could overcome any material disadvantage. They had seen it work in China, where poorly equipped Chinese forces with bolt-action rifles could not generate enough firepower to stop determined bayonet charges. What Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki and his men did not know, could not have known, was that the Americans waiting across that sandbar were not armed with bolt-action rifles. They were Marines, and they were holding Browning water-cooled machine guns and Browning automatic rifles, capable of firing 550 rounds per minute. The collision between Japanese tactical doctrine and American automatic firepower was about to become catastrophic. The lessons learned in that pre-dawn slaughter would echo across every island battle for the next 3 years. But first, hundreds of men would have to die, proving what should have been obvious. Spirit and steel cannot defeat physics and mathematics. August 7th, 1942. The 1st Marine Division had stormed ashore at Guadalcanal with orders to capture the Japanese airfield under construction at Lunga Point. The landing itself proved almost anticlimactic. Japanese construction crews and their small security force fled into the jungle, leaving behind equipment, supplies, and a partially completed runway. The Marines secured Henderson Field within 48 hours and began finishing the airstrip themselves. The strategic importance of this real estate was immediately obvious to both sides. Whoever controlled Henderson Field controlled the air approaches to the Solomon Islands. Whoever controlled the Solomons controlled the sea lanes between Australia and the United States. The Japanese Imperial General Headquarters understood this with perfect clarity. They could not allow this airfield to remain in American hands. Within days of the Marine landing, Tokyo began organizing counterattacks. The first would be led by Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, originally designated to capture Midway Island before that operation ended in disaster. Ichiki was a veteran officer, confident in his training and his men's fighting spirit. He had 916 soldiers under his command, elite troops from the 28th Infantry Regiment. These were not green conscripts. These were professionals who had spent years training in amphibious operations and night combat. Ichiki's orders were straightforward: land on Guadalcanal, march overland to Henderson Field, and destroy the small American garrison holding it. Japanese intelligence estimated no more than 2,000 Marines defended the airfield. Ichiki's force, they calculated, would be more than sufficient. The colonel shared this confidence. Japanese military doctrine emphasized moral superiority over material advantage. If your soldiers possessed greater fighting spirit than the enemy, if they were willing to die for the emperor while the enemy valued his own life, then numbers and weapons mattered less than determination. This philosophy had worked brilliantly in China. Japanese forces consistently defeated larger Chinese armies through aggressive night attacks and bayonet charges. The Chinese lacked automatic weapons at the squad level. Their soldiers carried bolt-action, rifles that required manual operation between each shot. A determined Japanese charge could cross the killing ground before Chinese riflemen could generate enough firepower to stop it. The Banzai charge, as Allied forces would later call it, emerged from this tactical reality. If the enemy lacked sustained automatic fire, mass and momentum could overwhelm prepared positions. If your soldiers feared dishonor more than death, they would press attacks that rational calculation suggested were suicidal. Most importantly, if you could get close enough for hand-to-hand combat, Japanese troops with bayonets and swords consistently defeated opponents in melee. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Colonel Ichiki landed his regiment on Guadalcanal on August 18, 1942. 6 destroyers provided covering bombardment, though American intelligence had already detected the Japanese reinforcement. Marines patrolling east of the Tenaru River discovered Japanese tracks and equipment. On August 19th, they ambushed a 34-man Japanese patrol, killing all of them. The American patrol leader noted something significant in his after-action report. The dead Japanese were cleanly shaven and wearing fresh uniforms. These were not soldiers who had been living in the jungle for weeks. These were new arrivals. Major General Alexander Vandergrift, commanding the 1st Marine Division, immediately understood what this meant. The Japanese were bringing in reinforcements and preparing a counterattack. He reinforced the eastern perimeter along the Tenaru River and positioned his heaviest weapons to cover likely approach routes. The Tenaru itself was barely a river. During dry seasons, it stood nearly stagnant, its surface covered in scum and fungus. Where it might have emptied into Iron Bottom Sound, a sandbar about 40 feet wide penned it up. This sandbar would become the killing ground. Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, dug in along the western bank of the Tenaru. His defensive line centered on heavy machine gun positions with interlocking fields of fire. These were Browning M 1917, a water-cooled 30-caliber machine guns. Each weapon weighed 93 pounds with water jacket and tripod. Each fired 450 to 600 rounds per minute. Each could maintain sustained fire as long as ammunition and cooling water held out. Supporting these positions were Browning automatic rifles. The M 1918A2 BAR was the squad automatic weapon that gave American infantry their crucial advantage in firepower. Weighing just under 20 pounds with a loaded magazine, the BAR fired the same .30-06 cartridge as the M 1903 Springfield rifle, but delivered it at 550 rounds per minute on the fast cyclic rate or 350 rounds per minute on slow. The Marines had one BAR per rifle squad, sometimes more. Pacific Theater doctrine emphasized the BAR as the center of infantry tactics. Riflemen supported and protected the BAR gunner. The BAR gunner provided the mobile firepower that could break enemy attacks or suppress enemy positions during advances. In defensive fighting, especially at night, the BAR was devastating. August 20th, 1942, evening. Marine listening posts detected movement on the eastern side of the Tenaru. Japanese troops were massing in the jungle. Colonel Ichiki was preparing his assault. His plan reflected orthodox Japanese tactical doctrine. Attack at night when American advantages in artillery and air support were neutralized. Attack aggressively, pressing forward regardless of casualties to close with the enemy before defensive fire could become effective. Attack with spirit and cold steel, trusting that American Marines, who valued their lives and feared death, would break under the pressure of men willing to die for the Emperor. At 1:30 in the morning of August 21st, 200 Japanese soldiers charged across the Tenaru sandbar directly into the Marine defensive line. They came screaming, "Banzai," as they ran. Behind them, the bulk of Ichiki's regiment waited in the jungle, preparing to exploit the breakthrough they expected. The Marines opened fire. Water-cooled Browning machine guns traversed the sandbar in methodical, overlapping patterns. 30-06 rounds, travelling at 2,800 feet per second, tore through the charging Japanese soldiers with mechanical precision. Browning automatic rifles added their fire from flanking positions. 550 rounds per minute meant more than 9 rounds every second. A skilled BAR gunner could keep his weapon firing in controlled bursts, 4 to 6 rounds at a time, walking his fire across multiple targets. The physics were brutal and simple. Human beings cannot cross open ground under sustained automatic fire from multiple positions. The body cannot move faster than bullets. Mass and momentum cannot overcome mathematics. The first wave of Japanese soldiers died on the sandbar. Some reached the American wire. A few actually made it across, only to be shot down by Marines in the forward foxholes. Not one reached the machine gun positions. Colonel Ichiki, watching from the jungle, made a decision that condemned hundreds of his men. He committed his remaining forces in a series of human wave attacks. Throughout the night, Japanese soldiers charged across the sandbar into American automatic fire. They threw themselves onto the barbed wire, forming human bridges for their comrades. They advanced in the darkness, sometimes within arm's length of Marine positions, only to be cut down by point-blank machine gun fire. The Marines fought with methodical discipline. Machine gun crews maintained their weapons, changing barrels when they overheated, feeding belt after belt of ammunition. BAR gunners fired until their 20-round magazines emptied, then reloaded and fired again. Riflemen with M1903 Springfields picked off individual targets that somehow survived the automatic fire. The noise was overwhelming. The sustained fire of multiple machine guns created a wall of sound that drowned out individual shots. Tracer rounds arced through the darkness, every fifth round burning phosphorescent as it flew. Muzzle flashes lit the jungle in strobe-like bursts. The screaming of attacking Japanese soldiers mixed with the mechanical chatter of Brownings. By dawn, the battlefield was carpeted with Japanese dead. Marine Sergeant John Basilone, who would earn the Medal of Honor 2 months later in similar fighting, described what he saw at first light. The Japs were stacked 3 deep in front of our positions. I counted 38 dead in front of one gun. They just kept coming, and we just kept firing. Lieutenant Hugh Corrigan, inspecting the sandbar after the battle, sat on a coconut log and stared at the carnage. His eyes had already taken on what Guadalcanal veterans called the stare, pupils that seemed darker, larger, more absolute. There must have been 1,000 of them, he told his men. They were crazy. They didn't even fire their rifles. This last observation was crucial. The Japanese attack had been almost purely a bayonet charge. Many soldiers never fired their Arisaka rifles. They had been trained that the decisive moment would come in hand-to-hand combat, where Japanese spirit and steel would triumph. They never reached hand-to-hand range. American automatic fire killed them at 30, 40, 50 yards distance. Some died 100 yards from the Marine positions, shot down before they even reached the sandbar. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, realizing his regiment had been annihilated, committed ritual suicide. Of the 800 soldiers who participated in the Banzai charge, fewer than 30 survived. Marine casualties were 43 killed and 75 wounded. The disparity in losses reflected the disparity in firepower. The Battle of the Tenaru was the first major test of American automatic weapons against Japanese Banzai charge tactics. The results should have made Japanese commanders reconsider their entire approach to infantry combat. They did not. October 24, 1942, Guadalcanal. Sergeant John Basilone commanded 2 sections of heavy machine guns defending a narrow trail south of Henderson Field. His position was part of Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller's defensive line along what Marines called the Ridge. At 10 in the evening, Japanese artillery began bombarding the American positions. Then came the screams. 3,000 soldiers from the Japanese Sendai Division were launching a coordinated night attack. These were elite troops, veterans of combat in China and Manchuria. They had been specially trained for this assault. They would not repeat Colonel Ichiki's mistake of charging directly into prepared positions. Instead, they would infiltrate through the jungle, use grenades and mortars to suppress American machine guns, then overwhelm the defenders with sheer numbers. The attack hit Basilone's position with terrifying intensity. Japanese soldiers came through the darkness from multiple directions. Grenades exploded among the American positions. Mortar rounds walked up and down the defensive line. One of Basilone's gun sections took a direct hit, killing or wounding most of the crew. The situation was desperate. If the machine guns went silent, the Japanese breakthrough would be unstoppable. Basilone grabbed a spare machine gun, a 90-pound Browning M1917 with its tripod, and physically carried it 200 yards through enemy fire to the silenced position. He set it up, loaded it, and began firing point-blank into the attacking Japanese. When that gun overheated and jammed, he repaired it under fire. When ammunition ran low, he made multiple trips through a gauntlet of enemy soldiers to bring up more belts. When his assistant gunners were wounded, he operated the weapon alone, firing and loading and changing barrels throughout the night. The asbestos glove that machine gunners used to change red-hot barrels was lost early in the fight. Basilone grabbed the glowing metal with his bare hands, suffering third-degree burns that scarred his arms permanently. He kept fighting. The noise that night was even worse than at the Tenaru. 3,000 attacking Japanese created a sustained roar of gunfire, grenades, and screaming. The Marine machine guns answered with their own mechanical thunder. Basilone later described it. The noise was terrific, and I could see the Japs leaping as they were smacked by our bullets, screaming, yelling, and dying all at the same time. Still they came, only to fall back, twisting and going through all sorts of motions as we dispatched them to their honourable ancestors. By dawn, the battlefield was strewn with Japanese dead. At least 38 enemy soldiers were credited to Basilone personally, though the actual number killed by his machine guns was certainly higher. More importantly, his section had held. The defensive line had not broken. Henderson Field remained in American hands. Sergeant Basilone received the Medal of Honor for his actions that night. He became the first enlisted Marine in World War II to earn America's highest decoration for valor. His citation specifically noted that he fought valiantly to check the savage and determined assault, and that his actions contributed in large measure to the virtual annihilation of a Japanese regiment. That last phrase deserves emphasis. A Japanese regiment, roughly 3,000 men, had attacked prepared Marine positions, defended by heavy machine guns and Browning automatic rifles. The regiment was virtually annihilated. Marine casualties were severe but manageable. The difference was firepower. The pattern established at the Tenaru in August had repeated in October. Japanese Banzai charge tactics could not overcome American automatic weapons, yet the attacks continued. The Japanese tactical manual emphasized spirit over material. It taught that moral superiority, the willingness to die for the emperor, would triumph over enemy cowardice. Losing entire regiments did not change this doctrine because the doctrine was not based on casualty calculations. It was based on honor, on Bushido, on spiritual beliefs that transcended rational military analysis. American commanders, watching these suicidal attacks, struggled to understand the mentality driving them. How could an army continue tactics that resulted in 90% casualties? Why would soldiers charge into machine gun fire when survival was impossible? The answer lay in the fundamental difference between American and Japanese military culture. American doctrine emphasized preserving your force while destroying the enemy's. You attacked when you had advantages in firepower, supplies, or position. You retreated or defended when the enemy held those advantages. Casualties were acceptable when necessary to achieve objectives, but unnecessary losses were considered failures of command. Japanese doctrine, especially by 1942, had evolved differently. The defense of every island was expected to be a fight to the death. Surrender was unthinkable. Retreat dishonored the emperor. If defeat was inevitable, the proper response was gyokusai, the shattering of the jewel, honorable annihilation in a final attack. The Banzai charge was not a desperate tactic. It was the expected culmination of any losing battle. This philosophical gap created a tactical nightmare for American forces. They could not predict enemy behavior using rational military calculations because the enemy was not making rational military calculations. They could only prepare for the worst and maintain overwhelming firepower. The Marines learned to position their automatic weapons with interlocking fields of fire, to stockpile ammunition at every gun position, to keep spare barrels ready for overheated machine guns. They learned to fix bayonets and sharpen knives because some Japanese soldiers would reach the American lines despite the automatic fire. They learned to recognize the signs of an impending Banzai charge: increased movement in the darkness, equipment clanking, voices growing louder and more confident. Sometimes the smell of sake would drift across from Japanese positions as soldiers fortified themselves with alcohol before the attack. Then the screaming would start, and the killing would begin. The tactical superiority of American automatic weapons became increasingly clear as the Pacific War progressed. At Tarawa in November 1943, Marines assaulting heavily fortified Japanese positions took terrible casualties. But when Japanese defenders launched Banzai counterattacks against Marine positions, they were slaughtered. At Saipan in July 1944, the Japanese mounted the largest Banzai charge of the entire war. General Yoshitsugu Saito gathered 4,300 soldiers, walking wounded, and even some civilians armed with bamboo spears. He ordered them to attack American positions in one final Gyokusai assault. At 04:45 on the morning of July 7th, this human wave slammed into the U.S. Army's 1st and 2nd Battalions, 105th Infantry Regiment. The soldiers, mostly National Guard troops from upstate New York, had been warned that an attack was coming. They had massed ammunition at every foxhole, positioned their Browning machine guns and BARs to cover likely approach routes, and fixed bayonets in preparation for close combat. When the Japanese charge hit, the carnage was apocalyptic. Major Edward McCarthy of the 105th later described it. It reminded me of one of those old cattle stampede scenes of the movies. The camera is in a hole in the ground, and you see the herd coming, and then they leap up and over you and are gone. Only the Japs just kept coming and coming. I didn't think they'd ever stop. The 105th Infantry's machine guns fired more than 10,000 rounds that morning. BAR gunners emptied magazine after magazine into the attacking masses. Browning water-cooled machine guns fired until their barrels glowed red, then crews changed barrels and kept firing. The Japanese found a gap between American battalions and poured through it, overrunning some positions. Hand-to-hand combat raged in the darkness. Some American soldiers were forced to swim out to destroyers offshore to escape being surrounded, but the automatic weapons held. By 1800 hours on July 7th, the attack had been repulsed. 4,311 Japanese soldiers were dead. The 105th Infantry lost 406 killed and 512 wounded. The casualty ratio was nearly 10-1. 3 American soldiers earned the Medal of Honor that day for their actions defending against the Banzai charge. Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien, Private Thomas Baker, and Captain Ben Salomon all fought with extraordinary courage as waves of Japanese attackers tried to overwhelm their positions. All 3 died in the fighting. Their citations emphasize the same theme that appeared in Basiloni's award. They held their positions against overwhelming numbers through superior firepower and determination. The Browning automatic rifle played a crucial role in these defensive battles. Unlike the heavy water-cooled machine guns that required crews and fixed positions, the BAR was mobile. One Marine could carry it, position it wherever firepower was needed, and provide sustained automatic fire that could stop multiple attackers. The M1918, a 2 Browning automatic rifle, adopted by the U.S. Army in June 1940, represented the culmination of John Moses Browning's genius for practical weapons design. Chambered in .30-06 Springfield, the same round used by the M1903 rifle and M1919 machine gun, it weighed 19 pounds empty, just over 20 pounds with a loaded magazine. The barrel was 24 inches long. Muzzle velocity was 2,822 feet per second. The bar's fire control system allowed 2 rates of automatic fire. On the fast cyclic rate, it fired approximately 550 rounds per minute. On the slow cyclic rate, approximately 350 rounds per minute. It fed from a 20-round detachable box magazine. The M1918. A 2, unlike earlier versions, had no semi-automatic setting. It fired only in fully automatic mode, though skilled gunners could deliver single shots by quick trigger control. The weapon came equipped with a bipod and flash suppressor, though many Pacific Theater Marines removed both to save weight and improve portability. The bipod alone weighed 2.5 pounds. Without it, the BAR weighed less than 17 pounds, light enough to carry all day through jungle terrain. The flash suppressor was designed to protect the gunner's night vision rather than hide muzzle flash from the enemy. Many Marines found it added weight without sufficient benefit and removed it. This field modification effectively returned the BAR to its original World War I configuration as a walking fire weapon, an automatic rifle carried by an individual soldier rather than a crew-served machine gun. The BAR's 20-round magazine was both its greatest limitation and a defining feature. It could not sustain fire like belt-fed machine guns. A skilled gunner could empty a magazine in less than 3 seconds on fast cyclic rate. Reloading took 5 to 7 seconds under optimal conditions, longer under combat stress. This meant BAR gunners had to be aggressive about magazine changes, reloading before they were completely empty rather than waiting until they ran dry in the middle of a fight. But the small magazine also made the BAR controllable in ways belt-fed weapons were not. A gunner could fire short bursts, conserving ammunition while maintaining accuracy. He could switch targets rapidly without wasting rounds. He could move positions quickly without dealing with ammunition belts or assistant gunners. The BAR filled a crucial tactical niche. It provided more firepower than a rifle but more mobility than a machine gun. It gave squad leaders a weapon that could suppress enemy positions, break up counterattacks, or provide covering fire during advances. It turned a 13-man Marine rifle squad into a unit capable of generating overwhelming firepower at the decisive point. Against Japanese Banzai charges, the BAR was devastating. Multiple BARs positioned with interlocking fields of fire could create a wall of bullets that no infantry assault could penetrate. The 550 rounds per minute cyclic rate meant that a BAR gunner could engage multiple targets in seconds, switching from one attacking soldier to the next without pause. Combined with Browning machine guns and M1903 rifles, American defensive positions could generate firepower that exceeded anything Japanese infantry had encountered in China. The Japanese had no equivalent weapon. Their Type 96 light machine gun, introduced in 1936, fired a 6.5mm round from a top-mounted 30-round magazine at 500 rounds per minute. It was lighter than the BAR at approximately 20 pounds loaded and reasonably reliable under good conditions. But it lacked the hitting power of the 30-06 cartridge. The 6.5mm round, while adequate for suppressive fire, did not have the penetration or stopping power of American ammunition. More critically, Japanese squad tactics did not emphasize automatic weapons the way American doctrine did. The Type 96 was assigned at the squad level, but Japanese tactical training focused on rifle fire and bayonet charges rather than sustained automatic fire. Japanese soldiers were taught to conserve ammunition, to fire carefully aimed single shots rather than spraying bullets. This made sense given Japan's limited industrial capacity and supply difficulties. It made less sense when facing enemies who could generate overwhelming volumes of fire. The philosophical difference ran deeper than tactics. American military doctrine, shaped by industrial abundance, emphasized firepower over manpower. If you could kill the enemy with bullets, you didn't need to risk soldiers in close combat. If you could suppress enemy positions with automatic fire, you could advance with minimal casualties. If you could generate superior firepower, you could win battles even when outnumbered. Japanese doctrine, shaped by centuries of samurai tradition and limited resources, emphasized spirit over material. The soldier's willingness to die mattered more than the weapons he carried. Victory came through moral superiority, through demonstrating that your men feared dishonor more than death. Close combat with bayonets and swords was not a fallback option when firearms failed. It was the ultimate expression of martial virtue, the moment when true warriors proved their worth. These incompatible philosophies collided across the Pacific with predictable results. Every major battle included at least one Banzai charge. Every Banzai charge ended in massive Japanese casualties and relatively light American losses. Every after-action report noted the same pattern. Automatic weapons, properly positioned and adequately supplied with ammunition, could stop any infantry assault, regardless of the attacker's courage or determination. The statistics from Guadalcanal tell the story with brutal clarity. Between August 7, 1942, and February 9, 1943, when Japanese forces finally evacuated the island, American forces killed approximately 19,000 Japanese soldiers. American dead numbered 1,600 Marines and Army troops. The casualty ratio was nearly 12-1. This disparity was not due to superior American courage or fighting skill. Japanese soldiers were brave to the point of fanaticism, superbly trained in infantry tactics, and willing to endure hardships that would have broken other armies. The disparity was due to firepower. American squads with Browning automatic rifles and supported by Browning machine guns could generate sustained automatic fire that Japanese squads with bolt-action rifles and limited automatic weapons could not match. The technological gap was not about innovation or sophistication. The BAR had been designed in World War I. The Browning machine gun dated to 1917. These were not new weapons. They were proven, reliable, mechanically simple designs that American industry could produce in massive quantities. The gap was about industrial capacity and tactical doctrine. The United States could manufacture hundreds of thousands of BARs and equip every rifle squad with automatic fire. America could ship millions of rounds of .30-06 ammunition across the Pacific and keep frontline units supplied even on remote islands. American tactical doctrine could adapt to emphasize these advantages, building infantry tactics around squad automatic weapons. Japan lacked this industrial capacity. Japanese factories produced excellent weapons, but not in sufficient quantities to equip every squad with automatic fire. Japanese supply lines, stretched across thousands of miles of ocean and constantly harassed by American submarines, could not maintain adequate ammunition stocks. Japanese tactical doctrine, rooted in cultural traditions that emphasized spirit over material, could not adapt quickly enough to changing realities. The result was a systematic slaughter that continued from Guadalcanal through Iwo Jima. Japanese soldiers, trained in tactics that had worked in China, repeatedly attacked American positions defended by weapons that made those tactics suicidal. They died by the thousands, achieving nothing except confirming their own courage and their commander's refusal to accept reality. At Peleliu in September 1944, Japanese defenders initially avoided Banzai charges, instead fighting from caves and fortified positions. This new defensive doctrine, developed by General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, acknowledged that Banzai charges were suicidal against American firepower. Instead, Japanese forces would make Americans pay for every yard in sustained defensive fighting. The new tactics worked better than Banzai charges, but still resulted in near-total Japanese casualties. At Peleliu, 10,695 Japanese defenders died. American casualties were 10,395, including 1,849 killed. For the first time in the Pacific War, the casualty ratio was nearly 1-to-1. This represented a significant improvement over Banzai charge tactics, which typically resulted in casualty ratios of 10 or 12-to-1. But the new defensive doctrine still could not overcome American advantages in firepower. Marines advancing on Peleliu faced intense resistance from cave positions. Japanese machine guns and rifles delivered heavy fire from hidden emplacements. Every advance required flamethrowers, demolition charges, and tank support to reduce the fortified positions. Yet when Japanese defenders emerged from their caves to counterattack American positions, the results remained the same. Browning automatic rifles and machine guns cut them down before they could close to hand-to-hand range. The tactical problem remained unsolvable. Japanese soldiers could not cross open ground under sustained, automatic fire. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Browning automatic rifle's combat record in the Pacific Theater earned it legendary status among Marines. Veterans described it with respect bordering on reverence. The weapon was reliable even under the worst conditions. Jungle humidity, coral dust, and salt spray degraded many weapons systems. The BAR kept functioning. Its gas-operated action and simple mechanism required minimal maintenance. Marines stripped and cleaned their BARs religiously, understanding that their lives depended on the weapon's reliability. They learned to field strip the BAR in darkness, to clear jams by touch, to recognize problems by sound. A properly maintained BAR could fire thousands of rounds without malfunction. An improperly maintained BAR would jam at the worst possible moment, potentially costing lives. The weapon's weight was both a strength and weakness. 20 pounds was heavy for a rifle but light for a machine gun. Marines carrying BARs on long patrols through jungle terrain felt every ounce, but that weight provided stability when firing. The BAR's mass-absorbed recoil, making it relatively controllable even in full automatic fire. A strong Marine could fire the weapon from the shoulder, walking his fire across multiple targets. Ammunition weight created additional challenges. Each 20-round magazine weighed approximately 1 pound, loaded with 30-06 cartridges. A bar gunner typically carried 12 to 16 magazines, adding 12 to 16 pounds to his load. Assistant gunners carried additional magazines, sometimes 20 or more. The squad had to balance firepower against mobility, automatic fire against endurance. Marines developed strong opinions about optimal BAR employment. Some advocated firing short bursts, 3 to 5 rounds at a time, to conserve ammunition and maintain accuracy. Others preferred longer bursts when facing massed attacks, accepting reduced accuracy in exchange for volume of fire. Some removed the bipod to save weight, others kept it for stability when firing from prepared positions. The Marine Corps officially recognized the BAR's importance by restructuring squad organization around it. By 1945, a standard 13-man Marine rifle squad included 3 4-man fire teams, each with 1 BAR. This gave squad leaders 3 automatic weapons that could be positioned independently or concentrated as needed. This was a significant doctrinal shift. Early in the war, Marine squads had 1 or 2 BARs supporting 8 to 10 riflemen with M1903 Springfields. By war's end, squads had 3 BARs supported by riflemen with Monet Garands. The squad's center of gravity had shifted from riflemen to automatic weapons. This reflected the tactical lessons learned through bitter experience. In offensive operations, the BAR could suppress enemy positions while riflemen maneuvered. In defensive operations, multiple BARs could create devastating crossfire that stopped enemy attacks. In meeting engagements, the side that got their BARs into action first usually won. The weapon's tactical value exceeded its technical specifications. Individual Marines who carried BARs in combat developed profound relationships with their weapons. They gave them names. They personalized them with minor modifications. They treated them with care that bordered on affection. This was partly superstition, the belief that a well-maintained weapon would keep you alive. But it was also practical recognition of dependence. A rifleman with a jammed Monet could fall back on his knife or grenades. A BAR gunner with a jammed weapon left his entire fire team without automatic fire support. The psychological weight exceeded the physical weight. BAR gunners knew they were priority targets. Enemy soldiers understood that eliminating automatic weapons was crucial to successful attacks. Japanese snipers specifically targeted Marines carrying BARs. Japanese infantry, when they got close enough, focused their fire on automatic weapons positions. The casualty rate for BAR gunners was significantly higher than for riflemen. One estimate suggested that the average combat life expectancy for a World War II BAR soldier was 30 minutes. This was likely an exaggeration, but it reflected the reality that automatic weapons drew fire. Marines carrying BARs knew they were marked men. They carried them anyway. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The weapon's psychological impact on Japanese soldiers was equally significant. Veterans of Guadalcanal and later battles reported that Japanese troops feared American automatic fire. The sustained, overlapping fire from multiple Browning weapons created psychological effects beyond the physical casualties they inflicted. Japanese soldiers trained to overcome fear through discipline and spiritual preparation. They were taught that courage meant advancing regardless of danger, that death in service to the emperor was honorable. But human nervous systems respond to sustained automatic fire, regardless of training or beliefs. The brain recognizes that crossing open ground under machine gun fire means death. The body resists even when the mind commands it forward. This created a terrible dilemma for Japanese infantry. Orders required them to attack. Honor required them to obey orders. Survival instinct required them to take cover. The psychological stress of repeatedly attacking into automatic fire, watching comrades die, knowing your own death was likely, broke men regardless of their training. Some Japanese veterans later described the experience of facing American automatic fire. The noise was overwhelming, drowning out commands and destroying coordination. The muzzle flashes in darkness were disorienting. The casualties were immediate and catastrophic. Men fell so quickly that attacks lost momentum before reaching enemy positions. Soldiers who survived one Banzai charge faced the psychological trauma of being ordered to make another. Yet the attacks continued. Japanese commanders, bound by doctrine and honor, could not adapt tactics that had been validated by success in China. The fact that those tactics failed against American firepower did not change the fundamental belief that spirit could overcome material disadvantage. Losses were attributed to insufficient fighting spirit rather than inadequate firepower. Defeated units were criticized for lacking determination rather than lacking automatic weapons. This institutional inability to learn from tactical failure ensured that the same mistakes would be repeated across every island in the Pacific. At Tarawa, at Saipan, at Guam, at Peleliu, at Iwo Jima, at Okinawa, Japanese commanders ordered Banzai charges against American positions defended by Browning weapons. Every attack ended the same way. The Japanese were annihilated. The Americans survived. The most detailed analysis of this tactical mismatch came from post-war interviews with surviving Japanese officers. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, who served as a staff officer in multiple Pacific campaigns, later acknowledged that Japanese infantry tactics had been designed for fighting Chinese forces with limited automatic weapons. Against Americans with squad-level automatic fire, those tactics were suicidal. Other Japanese veterans noted that American firepower made traditional infantry tactics impossible. You could not maneuver under sustained automatic fire. You could not assault prepared positions defended by machine guns. You could not win battles through superior spirit when the enemy possessed superior weapons and ammunition. These observations, obvious in retrospect, were not obvious to Japanese commanders during the war, or perhaps they were obvious but unacceptable. Admitting that American material superiority trumped Japanese spiritual superiority would have undermined the entire ideological foundation of the imperial military system. If courage and determination were insufficient to win battles, if weapons and industrial capacity mattered more than warrior spirit, then everything the Japanese military taught about Bushido and honor was false. This was an unthinkable conclusion. Japanese commanders could not admit it even to themselves. So they ordered another Banzai charge, and another, sacrificing divisions in attacks that achieved nothing except validating their own beliefs about honor. The Americans, watching these suicidal attacks, struggled with their own psychological response. Marines were trained to respect their enemies, to never underestimate opposition forces. But how could you respect an enemy who repeatedly employed tactics that resulted in his own annihilation? How could you fear soldiers who charged into machine gun fire with rifles and bayonets? Some Americans interpreted Japanese Banzai charges as evidence of fanaticism or irrationality. They concluded that Japanese soldiers were fundamentally different from American soldiers, less concerned with survival, more willing to die for abstract causes. This interpretation contained elements of truth, but missed deeper realities. Japanese soldiers were not irrational. They were operating within a military culture that defined rationality differently than American culture did. In American military thinking, preserving your force while destroying the enemy's force was rational. In Japanese military thinking, preserving honor while damaging the enemy was rational. These were incompatible definitions that led to incompatible tactics. The tragedy was not that Japanese soldiers lacked courage. They possessed courage in abundance, demonstrated repeatedly through willingness to attack against impossible odds. The tragedy was that their courage was wasted in tactics that could not succeed. Bravery became suicide. Honor became futility. Spirit became corpses stacked 3 deep in front of American machine gun positions. The Browning automatic rifle did not cause this tragedy. The weapon was simply a tool, a mechanism for converting chemical energy into kinetic energy, for propelling metal projectiles at high velocity toward intended targets. It did this efficiently and reliably, which was all its designers had intended. But the BAR's efficiency and reliability, multiplied across thousands of weapons deployed throughout the Pacific theater, created tactical realities that Japanese commanders could not overcome with existing doctrine. The weapon, and the industrial system that produced it in massive quantities represented American advantages that transcended individual battles or campaigns. By 1945, American forces had refined their defensive tactics against Banzai charges to a grim science. When intelligence suggested a major Japanese attack was imminent, commanders positioned maximum automatic weapons on the most likely approaches. They stockpiled ammunition at every gun position, far more than normal loadouts. They established overlapping fields of fire so that every approach route was covered by at least 2 automatic weapons. They prepared secondary positions in case primary positions were overrun. They briefed all personnel on what to expect and how to respond. When the attack came, usually at night, American forces followed established procedures. Machine guns fired in overlapping patterns, creating zones where nothing could survive. BARs provided mobile fire that could shift to meet threats as they developed. Riflemen engaged individual targets that penetrated the automatic fire. Artillery fired pre-registered concentrations on likely assembly areas. Illumination rounds turned night into day, destroying the attacker's advantage in darkness. The results were predictable and horrific. Japanese forces were cut down in waves. American casualties were relatively light. The tactical superiority of automatic fire over bolt-action rifles and bayonets was demonstrated again. Commanders filed after-action reports noting the same lessons. The cycle repeated at the next battle. Some Japanese commanders recognized the futility of Banzai charges and adapted their tactics. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, defending Iwo Jima in February 1945, explicitly forbade his troops from conducting Banzai charges. He ordered them to fight from prepared positions to make Americans pay for every yard without wasting Japanese lives in suicidal counterattacks. This defensive doctrine was more effective than Banzai charges, but it could not change the ultimate outcome. American firepower, supported by naval gunfire and air support, systematically reduced Japanese positions. The battle lasted longer than Guadalcanal or Saipan. American casualties were higher, but Japanese forces were still annihilated. The tactical problem remained unsolvable. The final major Banzai charge of World War II occurred on Okinawa in May 1945. Japanese forces, recognizing that the battle was lost, launched multiple Banzai attacks against American positions. The attacks followed the familiar pattern. Japanese soldiers charged American lines screaming Banzai. They were cut down by Browning machine guns and Browning automatic rifles. They achieved nothing except their own deaths. By this point in the war, American forces were so experienced in defeating Banzai charges that the attacks were almost routine. Marines and soldiers knew exactly what to expect and how to respond. The Japanese attacks, which had been terrifying at Guadalcanal in 1942, were merely predictable by Okinawa in 1945. This reflected the fundamental asymmetry of the Pacific War. American forces learned and adapted. Throughout the conflict, they developed new tactics, improved weapons systems, refined logistics and supply procedures. They built on success and analyzed failure. They fought more effectively in 1945 than they had in 1942. Japanese forces, constrained by culture and doctrine, could not adapt at the same rate. Individual units learned tactical lessons from bitter experience, but institutional knowledge did not spread effectively through the Japanese military system. Units defending islands in 1945 employed essentially the same tactics that had failed in 1942. The results remained the same. The human cost of this failure was staggering. Japanese combat deaths in the Pacific theater exceeded 1 million soldiers. Many died in conventional combat, killed by artillery, airstrikes, or rifle fire, but hundreds of thousands died in Banzai charges, killed by American automatic weapons while attempting impossible attacks against prepared positions. These deaths achieved nothing strategically. Japan lost the Pacific War, not because Japanese soldiers lacked courage, but because Japan lacked the industrial capacity to match American production. No amount of Banzai charges could overcome the reality that America produced more ships, more aircraft, more tanks, more ammunition than Japan could destroy. The tactical futility of Banzai charges mirrored the strategic futility of the entire Japanese war effort. Spirit and determination could not substitute for steel and oil. Courage could not overcome logistics. Honor could not defeat mathematics. The Browning automatic rifle, firing 550 rounds per minute, represented this mathematical reality in its most brutal form. Each round carried sufficient kinetic energy to kill a human being. Multiply that by 550 rounds per minute, by multiple BARs per squad, by dozens of squads per battalion, by multiple battalions per division, and you created firepower that no infantry force could survive. Japanese soldiers, trained to believe that spirit trumped material, discovered that belief was false when they charged into that firepower. The discovery killed them. The lesson, purchased with hundreds of thousands of lives, was never learned by the commanders who kept ordering the charges. In the final analysis, the collision between Japanese Banzai charge tactics and American automatic fire was not a battle between different strategies or different technologies. It was a collision between different philosophies of warfare, different definitions of honor, different assumptions about what mattered in combat. American military culture emphasized practical effectiveness over spiritual purity. If automatic weapons were effective, use automatic weapons. If defensive fighting preserved your force better than offensive fighting, fight defensively. If retreat allowed you to regroup and attack more effectively later, retreat. There was no shame in practical decisions made to achieve military objectives. Japanese military culture emphasized honor over effectiveness. If Bushido required offensive action, attack even if defense was tactically superior. If honor forbade retreat, die in place even if retreat would preserve the force. If tradition demanded Banzai charges, charge even if the charge was suicidal. Effectiveness mattered less than maintaining spiritual purity. These incompatible philosophies ensured that the Pacific War would be extraordinarily bloody. American firepower killed Japanese soldiers efficiently. Japanese honor ensured those soldiers kept attacking into that firepower. The cycle continued until Japan's industrial capacity collapsed and American forces stood at the gates of the home islands. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 ended the war before American forces had to invade Japan itself. Post-war analysis suggested that such an invasion would have cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties and millions of Japanese casualties, both military and civilian. The planned invasion of Japan anticipated the ultimate Banzai charge, 100 million Japanese civilians and soldiers sacrificing themselves in defense of the homeland. The phrase Ichioku Gyokusai, meaning 100 million shattered jewels, had become official government policy. Every Japanese citizen was expected to resist to the death. Given what American forces had experienced across 3 years of island fighting, this was not rhetorical exaggeration. Japanese civilians on Saipan and Okinawa had committed suicide rather than surrender to American forces. Japanese soldiers consistently fought to the death rather than accept capture. There was every reason to believe that invading Japan would trigger the largest Banzai charge in history, an entire nation committing Gyokusai. The atomic bombs made that final sacrifice unnecessary. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. The Banzai charges ended. The systematic slaughter of Japanese infantry attacking American automatic weapons finally stopped. The aftermath of the Pacific War left questions that transcended tactical analysis. How many Japanese soldiers had died unnecessarily in Banzai charges? How many lives could have been saved if Japanese commanders had adapted their tactics to the reality of American automatic fire? How many American casualties had been avoided because Japanese forces employed suicidal tactics instead of effective defensive fighting? These questions had no definitive answers. But the patterns were clear. Battles where Japanese forces fought from prepared positions and avoided Banzai charges resulted in higher American casualties and longer campaigns. Peleliu and Iwo Jima, where Japanese commanders forbade suicidal charges and emphasized defensive fighting, cost American forces dearly. Guadalcanal and Saipan, where Japanese forces repeatedly launched Banzai charges, resulted in overwhelming Japanese casualties and relatively quick American victories. The tactical lesson was obvious. Banzai charges were militarily ineffective. They wasted Japanese manpower. achieved no strategic objectives, and simplified the American tactical problem. A rational military system would have abandoned the tactic after the first few disasters. The Japanese military system was not rational by American standards. It operated according to different principles, valued different outcomes, defined success and failure differently than American military culture did. This fundamental incompatibility made the Pacific War uniquely brutal. The European theatre saw terrible fighting, massive casualties, and strategic bombing campaigns that devastated cities. But European armies on both sides operated within similar military traditions. They understood each other's tactics, respected similar concepts of honor, negotiated surrenders according to shared conventions. The Pacific War lacked this common understanding. American forces could not comprehend why Japanese soldiers charged into machine gun fire. Japanese forces could not comprehend why Americans valued survival over honor. Neither side understood the other's motivations or decision-making processes. The result was combat stripped of restraint, battles fought to annihilation rather than surrender, a war that ended only when one side was physically incapable of continuing. The Browning automatic rifle played its role in this brutal drama. The weapon itself was morally neutral, a tool that functioned according to mechanical principles regardless of who used it or against whom. But in the hands of American Marines facing Banzai charges, it became the instrument that enforced reality against fantasy, that demonstrated conclusively that courage and determination could not overcome firepower and industrial capacity. Every BAR that fired 550 rounds per minute into attacking Japanese soldiers was a small lesson in this larger truth. Every magazine emptied into a Banzai charge was evidence that modern industrial warfare had made traditional infantry tactics obsolete. Every battle where American automatic fire stopped Japanese attacks was confirmation that the nature of combat had changed in ways that some militaries refused to acknowledge. The post-war legacy of the Browning automatic rifle extended far beyond World War II. The weapon remained in American service through the Korean War and into the early years of Vietnam. It fought in different terrain against different enemies, but its essential role remained the same. It provided squad-level automatic fire that allowed small units to generate overwhelming firepower at decisive moments. In Korea, the BAR again proved its worth against human wave attacks. Chinese and North Korean forces employed tactics similar to Japanese Banzai charges, though usually with better tactical coordination and more effective use of terrain. The results were similar. American positions defended by BARs and machine guns inflicted massive casualties on attacking forces. The weapon that had stopped Japanese charges at Guadalcanal stopped Chinese charges at the Chosin Reservoir. By the 1960s, the BAR was finally phased out in favor of the M14 rifle with selective fire capability and the M60 general-purpose machine gun. These newer weapons offered improved performance in some areas, but veterans who had carried BARs in World War II and Korea often expressed nostalgia for the old weapon. They remembered its reliability, its firepower, its solid construction that felt reassuring in combat. The M1918, a Browning automatic rifle, had been produced in total quantities exceeding 200,000 units during World War II. These weapons had fought across every theatre of that global conflict. They had armed American soldiers storming Normandy beaches, Marines assaulting Pacific islands, and paratroopers jumping into Holland. They had served with Allied forces around the world. They had become one of the iconic weapons of the American military arsenal. But the BAR's most significant contribution was specifically in the Pacific theatre against Japanese Banzai charges. In that particular tactical situation, the weapon's combination of portability, reliability, and sustained automatic fire proved ideal. A Marine rifle squad with 3 BARs could stop attacks that would have overwhelmed squads armed only with bolt-action rifles. The weapon's presence in American defensive lines made the difference between survival and annihilation. Individual Marines who carried BARs in combat developed deep respect for the weapon that had kept them alive. They remembered the weight of carrying it through jungle terrain. They remembered the recoil slamming into their shoulders as they fired. They remembered the mechanical chatter of the action cycling, the smell of burnt powder, the heat radiating from the barrel after sustained fire. They remembered their lives depending on the weapon's reliability and the weapon never failing them. These personal memories, multiplied across thousands of veterans, created the BAR's legendary status. It was not the most advanced weapon of World War II. It was not the most powerful or the most accurate. But it was reliable, effective, and available in sufficient quantities when and where it was needed. In warfare, these practical virtues often matter more than theoretical performance specifications. The tactical lessons learned from the BAR's employment against Banzai charges influenced American military doctrine for decades. The emphasis on squad-level automatic fire became a permanent feature of American infantry organization. Future weapons systems were designed to maintain or enhance this capability. The principle that small units should possess organic automatic firepower became foundational to American tactical thinking. This represented recognition that modern infantry combat was fundamentally about firepower. Maneuver, tactics, and training remained important, but the side that could generate superior firepower at the decisive point usually won the engagement. The BAR, by providing automatic fire at the squad level, gave American infantry units tactical flexibility that enemy forces often could not match. The weapon also represented something larger about American military culture and industrial capacity. The United States approached warfare as an industrial problem to be solved through production and logistics. If automatic weapons provided tactical advantages, then American industry would produce automatic weapons in massive quantities. If those weapons required enormous amounts of ammunition, then American industry would produce that ammunition, and American logistics would deliver it to frontline units. This approach was not militarily sophisticated in traditional terms. European military theorists had spent centuries developing elegant strategic concepts and tactical doctrines. The American approach was comparatively crude: build more weapons than the enemy, fire more ammunition than the enemy, replace casualties faster than the enemy, sustain operations longer than the enemy, win through material superiority rather than strategic brilliance. But this crude approach worked. American industrial capacity, mobilized for total war, produced weapons and ammunition in quantities that no enemy could match. American logistics, developed across thousands of miles of ocean, delivered those weapons and ammunition to combat units fighting on remote islands. American tactical doctrine, built around this material abundance, employed firepower lavishly rather than conserving it. The result was a military system that defeated enemies through overwhelming force rather than superior tactics. It was not elegant, it was not efficient by European standards, but it was effective, and in warfare, effectiveness matters more than elegance. The Browning automatic rifle exemplified this American approach. The weapon was not sophisticated, its mechanism was simple, its capabilities were straightforward, but it was reliable, manufacturable in large quantities, and effective at its intended role. These practical virtues, combined with American industrial capacity and tactical doctrine that emphasized firepower, made it a decisive weapon in the Pacific theater. Japanese soldiers who survived Banzai charges against American positions defended by BARs carried memories of that firepower for the rest of their lives. They remembered the sound of multiple automatic weapons firing simultaneously. They remembered comrades falling around them as bullets found targets. They remembered the impossibility of crossing open ground under sustained fire. They remembered orders to attack again the next night, knowing the attack would fail just as the previous night's attack had failed. These memories, shared among Japanese veterans after the war, contributed to Japan's post-war pacifism and rejection of militarism. The generation that had experienced the futility of Banzai charges understood viscerally what their commanders had refused to acknowledge. Spirit could not overcome firepower. Honor could not defeat industrial capacity. Courage could not substitute for effective tactics and adequate weapons. This understanding, purchased with hundreds of thousands of lives, represented perhaps the most important lesson of the Pacific War. Modern warfare had made traditional military virtues insufficient. Courage, discipline, and fighting spirit remained necessary, but were no longer sufficient for victory. Industrial capacity, technological sophistication, and tactical adaptation mattered more than traditional warrior values. American forces learned this lesson earlier than Japanese forces, partly because American military culture was less invested in traditional warrior values, partly because American industrial capacity provided the material foundation for firepower-based tactics. The Marines who fought at Guadalcanal quickly recognized that automatic weapons were decisive. They adapted their tactics to maximize this advantage. They developed doctrine around the BAR and other automatic weapons. They won battles by applying superior firepower rather than superior courage. Japanese forces, constrained by cultural values that emphasized spirit over material, could not adapt as quickly. Individual soldiers and junior officers understood that Banzai charges were suicidal, but institutional doctrine, supported by cultural beliefs about honor and duty, could not change. Senior commanders continued ordering attacks that subordinates knew would fail. Soldiers continued obeying orders they knew would kill them. The cycle continued until Japan's capacity to resist collapsed. The human cost of this cultural inflexibility exceeded all tactical considerations. Japanese combat deaths in the Pacific Theater represented not just military losses, but a generation of young men sacrificed to doctrines their commanders refused to change. Many of these deaths were unnecessary from a purely military perspective. They achieved no strategic objectives, captured no territory, delayed no American advances. They simply filled body count statistics that confirmed American tactical superiority. American casualties, while significant, were dramatically lower than they could have been if Japanese forces had employed more effective tactics. Banzai charges, by concentrating attackers in kill zones covered by automatic weapons, simplified American defensive problems. If Japanese forces had consistently fought from prepared positions using defensive tactics optimized for their weapons and training, American casualties would have been much higher. The Pacific War would have lasted longer and cost more American lives. In this sense, Japanese tactical doctrine helped America win the Pacific War. By repeatedly employing tactics that played to American strengths and Japanese weaknesses, Japanese commanders accelerated their own defeat. They could not adapt because adaptation would have required admitting that their fundamental beliefs about warfare were wrong. This admission was culturally impossible, so they continued ordering Banzai charges until they had no more soldiers to order into the attacks. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The Browning automatic rifle, firing 550 rounds per minute, was the weapon that enforced this brutal arithmetic. Each burst from each BAR was evidence that modern warfare had changed in ways that made traditional tactics obsolete. Each magazine emptied into attacking Japanese soldiers was confirmation that firepower trumped spirit, that industrial capacity defeated courage, that reality could not be wished away through force of will. The weapon itself carried no moral weight. It was simply metal and wood, assembled according to John Moses Browning's design, converted ammunition into projectiles according to mechanical principles. But in the context of the Pacific War, the BAR became symbolic of larger truths about modern combat. It represented the dominance of industrial warfare over traditional military values. It demonstrated that weapons and tactics mattered more than courage and determination. It proved that armies which could not adapt to technological reality would be destroyed by enemies who could. Marines who carried BARs at Guadalcanal, at Tarawa, at Saipan, at Peleliu, at Iwo Jima, at Okinawa understood this intuitively. They knew their weapon was keeping them alive. They knew it was killing enemy soldiers efficiently. They knew the tactical balance of combat favored them as long as they maintained their automatic fire. They did not philosophize about industrial warfare or cultural differences. They simply loaded another magazine and fired another burst when the next Banzai charge came screaming out of the darkness. This practical, immediate relationship between the weapon and survival created bonds that lasted lifetimes. Veterans decades after the war could still field strip a BAR blindfolded. They remembered the weight distribution, the balance point, the feel of the trigger, the sight picture, the recoil pattern. These physical memories were inseparable from memories of combat, of friends killed, of attacks stopped, of battles won. The weapon was not just a tool, it was part of their identity as Marines who had fought and survived the Pacific War. The Japanese soldiers who attacked those Marine positions had their own memories and their own relationships with their weapons. They carried Arisaka Type 38 or Type 99 rifles, excellent bolt-action weapons that were accurate and reliable. They had trained extensively with these rifles, learned to shoot accurately, maintained them meticulously. Under different tactical circumstances, against different enemies, these rifles would have been adequate. But against Marines with Browning automatic rifles and machine guns, the Arisaka rifle was inadequate. Its bolt-action mechanism required manual operation between shots. A skilled rifleman could fire perhaps 15 aimed shots per minute. This was respectable performance for a bolt-action rifle. It was utterly insufficient when facing weapons that fired 550 rounds per minute. The mathematical disparity was so extreme that no amount of training or courage could overcome it. Japanese soldiers recognized this disparity. They experienced it during attacks when their comrades were cut down before they could close to bayonet range. They experienced it when American defensive fire was so intense that advancing became physically impossible. They experienced it when entire companies charged American positions and only a handful survived to retreat into the jungle. They knew, at a visceral level, that their weapons and tactics were inadequate against American firepower. But knowing this did not change their orders. Japanese military doctrine did not allow soldiers to refuse attacks because the attacks were likely to fail. Honor required obedience regardless of consequences. Bushido demanded that soldiers advance when ordered, regardless of tactical circumstances. Cultural values that had evolved over centuries of samurai tradition could not be discarded simply because they had become militarily obsolete. This created the central tragedy of the Pacific War. Japanese soldiers possessed courage that American Marines respected. They demonstrated discipline and endurance that would have done credit to any army. They fought with determination that their commanders could not question, but they fought using tactics that ensured their own destruction. Their virtues were deployed in service of doctrines that made those virtues suicidal. American forces, watching wave after wave of Japanese soldiers charge into automatic fire, struggled to understand the mentality that drove these attacks. Some interpreted it as fanaticism, some as irrationality, some as evidence that Japanese were fundamentally different from Americans in their attitude toward death. All these interpretations missed the deeper reality. Japanese soldiers were neither fanatic nor irrational. They were products of a military culture that defined honor and duty differently than American culture did. They made rational choices within that cultural framework, even when those choices were suicidal by American standards. The collision between these incompatible military cultures, mediated through weapons like the Browning automatic rifle, created the Pacific War's unique character. It was not a war where both sides fought according to shared rules and conventions. It was a war where fundamental assumptions about combat, honor, and victory differed so profoundly that mutual understanding was impossible. Each side fought according to its own logic, achieving goals that the other side could not comprehend. American forces fought to win while minimizing their own casualties. Japanese forces fought to demonstrate honor regardless of casualties. American success was measured by territory captured and enemy forces destroyed. Japanese success was measured by loyalty demonstrated and honor maintained. These incompatible definitions ensured that the war could end only with the complete destruction of Japan's capacity to resist. Negotiated peace was impossible because the two sides could not agree on what constituted acceptable terms. The Browning automatic rifle's role in this larger drama was specific and limited. It was one weapon among many that American forces employed. But it was crucial at decisive moments. When Japanese forces launched Banzai charges, when the tactical situation demanded sustained automatic fire to stop massed infantry attacks, the BAR was there. Marines carrying BARs held positions that otherwise would have been overrun. They stopped attacks that otherwise would have succeeded. They survived battles that otherwise would have killed them. The weapon's technical specifications mattered less than its availability and reliability when needed. 550 rounds per minute was not remarkably fast compared to other automatic weapons. 20-round magazines were small compared to belt-fed systems. The BAR's capabilities were good but not exceptional. What made it exceptional was that it worked consistently under terrible conditions, that it was present in sufficient quantities at the squad level, that Marines knew how to employ it effectively, and that American industry could supply unlimited ammunition to keep it firing. These practical factors, more than any technical sophistication, made the BAR decisive. Modern warfare, as the Pacific Theater demonstrated repeatedly, was not about individual weapons performance. It was about systems, logistics, doctrine, training, and industrial capacity working together. The BAR was effective because it was part of a larger system that supported its employment. Japanese light machine guns might have been technically comparable, but Japan lacked the industrial capacity to produce them in sufficient quantities, the logistics to keep them supplied with ammunition, and the tactical doctrine to employ them effectively at the squad level. The broader lesson transcended specific weapons or tactics. 20th century warfare had become industrial warfare. Victory went to nations that could mobilize their industrial economies for military production, that could sustain logistics across global distances, that could replace losses faster than enemies could inflict them. Traditional military virtues, courage, discipline, tactical skill remained necessary but were no longer sufficient. Industrial capacity determined outcomes as much as battlefield performance. Japan understood this intellectually. Japanese strategic planners knew their industrial capacity could not match American production. They gambled that quick victories and American war weariness would force a negotiated peace before American industrial superiority became decisive. The gamble failed. The war lasted long enough for American industry to reach full production. Japanese forces, fighting with courage and skill, were ground down by an enemy that could replace every loss and maintain every forward position indefinitely. The result was predictable once the initial Japanese offensives failed. American industrial capacity would eventually overwhelm Japanese resistance. The only questions were how long the war would last and how many casualties both sides would suffer. Japanese tactical decisions, particularly the continued use of Banzai charges, affected these variables, but could not change the ultimate outcome. Every Banzai charge that was stopped by American automatic fire shortened the war slightly. Every Japanese unit annihilated in suicidal attacks was a unit that could not defend subsequent positions. Every soldier killed charging American machine guns was a soldier who could not fight more effectively in defensive positions. Japanese tactical doctrine, by emphasizing offense over defense and honor over effectiveness, accelerated Japan's defeat. American tactical doctrine, by emphasizing firepower over manpower and effectiveness over elegance, conserved American strength while destroying Japanese forces. The Marines who fought at Guadalcanal understood this intuitively. They knew that killing Japanese soldiers with automatic fire was preferable to fighting them hand-to-hand. They knew that stopping Banzai charges at 30 yards was better than stopping them at 3 yards. They knew that superior firepower made combat safer for themselves and more lethal for their enemies. These intuitive understandings, validated through combat experience and incorporated into doctrine, gave American forces systematic advantages. They did not need to be braver than Japanese soldiers. They did not need to be more skilled in individual combat. They simply needed to apply superior firepower effectively. The Browning automatic rifle, combined with machine guns, artillery, air support, and naval gunfire, provided that firepower. The weapon's legacy extends beyond its service life. The BAR influenced subsequent American weapons development and tactical doctrine. The principle that rifle squads should possess organic automatic fire became fundamental to American infantry organization. Later weapons, from the M14 to the M16 to the M249, reflected this principle. Squad automatic weapons remained central to American infantry tactics throughout the Cold War and into the 21st century. This doctrinal continuity traced directly to lessons learned in the Pacific Theater. The battles where BARs stopped Banzai charges demonstrated that automatic fire at the squad level was tactically decisive. Post-war analysis confirmed these observations. Weapons development programs ensured that future American infantry squads would maintain comparable or superior automatic fire capability. The larger lesson was about adaptation and institutional learning. American military institutions learned from combat experience and modified doctrine accordingly. They recognized what worked, analyzed why it worked, and incorporated those lessons into training and equipment development. This institutional flexibility, as much as industrial capacity, contributed to American military effectiveness. Japanese military institutions, constrained by cultural factors and institutional rigidity, could not adapt as effectively. They recognized problems but could not implement solutions that conflicted with fundamental doctrinal beliefs. This institutional inflexibility, as much as industrial limitations, contributed to Japanese military defeat. The Pacific War thus became a test not just of military strength, but of institutional adaptability. The side that could learn faster, adapt more effectively, and implement improvements more quickly held decisive advantages. American forces demonstrated superior adaptability. Japanese forces, for all their courage and skill, could not match this organizational flexibility. The Browning automatic rifle, firing its 550 rounds per minute into Japanese Banzai charges, was both a weapon and a symbol. As a weapon, it killed enemy soldiers efficiently. As a symbol, it represented American industrial capacity, tactical flexibility, and institutional adaptability. It embodied the characteristics that allowed America to win the Pacific War, not through superior courage or traditional military virtues, but through superior production, logistics, and willingness to adapt tactics to technological realities. The Marines who carried BARs at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa did not think about symbols or institutional adaptability. They thought about survival, about their weapons' reliability, about keeping their squad alive through the next Banzai charge. But their practical employment of this weapon, multiplied across thousands of similar engagements, determined the Pacific War's outcome as surely as strategic decisions made by admirals and generals. Individual soldiers and small unit actions matter in warfare. The tactical level, where weapons meet flesh and decisions are measured in seconds, determines whether strategic plans succeed or fail. The Browning automatic rifle, in the hands of Marines who knew how to use it, made the difference between American victory and defeat at crucial moments. Those moments, accumulated across 3 years of island fighting, decided the war. The Japanese infantrymen who charged into that automatic fire, brave to the point of self-sacrifice, determined in their loyalty to the Emperor, could not overcome the mathematical reality of firepower differentials. Spirit could not deflect bullets. Courage could not cross ground swept by sustained automatic fire. Honor could not change physics. The collision between Japanese valor and American firepower ended the same way every time. The Americans survived. The Japanese died. The war continued until Japan had no more soldiers to send into Banzai charges. This was the brutal truth that the Browning automatic rifle enforced across the Pacific theater. It was truth written in empty cartridge casings piled around Marine defensive positions, truth written in Japanese bodies stacked before American lines. Truth written in casualty reports that showed the same patterns battle after battle. Truth that Japanese commanders refused to accept until atomic bombs forced unconditional surrender. The weapon itself was innocent of this larger tragedy. It functioned according to mechanical principles, indifferent to the philosophical questions its employment raised. But in the specific context of the Pacific War, the BAR became the instrument that taught the hardest lesson of modern warfare. In industrial war, material factors trump moral factors. Production capacity beats warrior spirit. Firepower defeats courage. These truths had always existed, but the Pacific War demonstrated them with unusual clarity. The Browning automatic rifle, firing 550 rounds per minute, was simply the tool that made the lesson explicit. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.